Good evening, everyone. It's great to be back at Fibre 15 this evening, and we're very excited to welcome you to our first online event of the new season. You will have likely heard much about tonight's speaker in the last few weeks. She's been all over the airwaves launching her smash hit new book, What a Way to Go, which instantly shot to number 5 on the Sunday Times bestseller list upon its release. So we're very pleased to have writer and journalist Bella Mackie with us this evening. Bella's debut novel, How to Kill Your Family, was a #1 bestseller, and it spent 47 weeks in the top 10. It will soon be adapted for television by Netflix. Bella will be speaking about What a Way to Go this evening with Alexandra Heminsley, a best-selling author, journalist, and broadcaster, whose books have been published in 15 countries and include Running Like a Girl, Under the Same Stars, and The Queue. Both of our speakers' books were on sale from New and Bookshop this evening, and details about how to order those will be posted in the chat shortly. Remember too that we'll have time for your questions towards the end of the hour, so please do submit these in the Q&A box at any point during the event, and we'll get to as many as we can. Without any further ado, Alex, Bella, welcome.
I'm here.
Hello.
Hi.
How are
Hi,
you?
Bella, and hi to everyone at home this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Bella, for coming and chatting to us with five times 15 this evening.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's always nice to do an online event because you get to stay warm in your house, and also, you can't possibly go all over the country. So it's lovely. It's really nice.
Yeah. Now then, should we get to it? Jack's given us a brilliant introduction, so we've all got our bearings with who we are. So I'm going to dive straight in with What a Way to Go. And as I was reading, I was keeping a little list of part this, part that, and it goes part Succession, part Serial, and then there's a part, and then there's some ellipsis, and then Christmas Carol. I was like, is that weird? And then there's a squiggly line and it says Jilly Cooper. So
Nice. I like that.
I feel like that's where I'm at with the composite parts of sort of inspirations for the novel. And before I do a deep dive with you on what your inspiration was, can we hear about the characters, the motley crew of Despicables?
Yeah, and they are all despicable. So it sort of centers around this family, the Wistern family, and that involves Anthony Wistern, who is the patriarch, and he's a very successful financial, he's a money man. And his wife Olivia, who is, a social butterfly. She is, she's a very good standing in the social scenes that she wants to be a part of. And then they have 4 children, and 4 is important because I think the more children you have, if you're incredibly wealthy, the more it shows that you're successful. You can afford to have many, many children. And the children are sort of delinquent, layabouts, vain, money grabbing. There's sort of not a redeeming feature to be found amongst the children, really.
They're a terrible illustration of indulgence.
Yeah, it's that kind of that second generation wealth thing where the grandfather will make the money, the parents will sort of inherit and try and do something with it, and then the third lot just do whatever they want, go clubbing all the time. So there's this family, and then very early on in the book, Anthony, the father, dies in a really hideous way. And then the family is sort of left to pick up the pieces. They're squabbling over the money. They're dealing with reputational damage. They're trying to figure out how their father died. And then on top of that, there is this outsider, the sleuth. She's unnamed throughout the book. And she is a true crime armchair detective who is desperate to try and solve Anthony Wistern's murder and make herself famous in the process. So those are our kind of main characters, and as you said, they're all pretty despicable.
And it's told from a sort of unusual perspective because we have the opening and it's this glorious 60th birthday party, no expense spared, real kind of, I feel like it would have been covered in the golden age of Hello magazine.
And Hello magazine is what I read as a kid in the hairdressers when my mum would go there, and I read it cover to cover.
Totally.
So I'm sure that's where my inspiration comes from, is 90s Hello magazine.
Yes, that was kind of like my internal mood board was reading that. And we see Anthony, well, we don't see the exact moment of Anthony die, but he dies at this party. And it's not so much a twist, but the quirk of the storytelling is that he doesn't just die and shut up. he is then taken to the South Gloucestershire Processing Centre, which is sort of part purgatory, part mental health facility, part just sort of nondescript government department. And he has to work, he can't kind of move on till that's their term. They're these sort of like sort of Instagrammy speak, but also sort of government speak type busybodies there who tell him he can't move on till he's worked out how he died. So we're seeing the story in part from his perspective, and he's working out who he could or couldn't have trusted. So we see all these characters in multiple lights. And then there's the added spice of the sleuth. So could you talk to me a little bit about the inspiration for the South Gloucester Processing Centre? It's such a cunning device to like allow your character to carry on partaking in the novel when the novel is in fact about their demise.
So I think the first thing was that I'd started the book writing him and knowing that he would die, but not quite realizing how quickly it would be. And then found myself really enjoying writing his voice. I was really enjoying living through this incredibly successful, arrogant man who has no thoughts of, oh my God, did I upset someone? Oh my God, have I done the wrong thing? He just lives his life in the most confident way. And I loved that. I was like, God, this is such a nice change of pace for my own brain. So I thought, oh my goodness, I want to keep him going. How do I do that? I thought, okay, I could do it in flashbacks. I could tell that story like that. But I wanted him to be looking at his family and wondering what the hell was going on. So I started to attempt writing, a sort of purgatory and afterlife for him. And then I thought, oh my goodness, I'm sort of straying out of my genre here. I'm sort of slightly moving into fantasy or something else. And I worried about that. I thought, oh, I'm crossing into something that I might not fully understand. But then I thought, actually, I thought my last book was quite hard to position anyway. And actually, I think probably you don't need to stick to one genre. And I felt like it was working. So I sort of carried on with it. And I think purgatory came to me in two ways. One was that I thought, what's the kind of place that a man like that would hate more than anywhere else in the world? Somewhere where officious women, are telling him he has no standing, and they don't listen to him. They
there's no club lounge. It's sit here on a plastic chair. End of conversation.
Yeah. His money can't get him to a better level. And I think partly that was inspired by, I had appendicitis this time last year, and it burst, and I ended up with like a really hideous infection, and I was in hospital for 5 days. And when you're in hospital, it is like the great leveler. You're in an NHS ward, everyone's in there, every walk of life is in there. It's incredibly run down. It's stiflingly hot, it's overhead lighting, it's officious nurses who just want you to get up and get better, but you're stuck there until they tell you that you can go home. It's kind of a marker that's constantly changing. So I was there for 5 days just thinking, how do I get out of here? How do I get out of here? And the only way to get through that is to realize, to surrender your kind of authority and your wishes, and just sort of lie there and think, there's nothing I can do here. And they have those posters that say, we wish you well, be kind to our staff, and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of fake jovial things that actually you think, no, like this is a grim place where no one wants to be, but we're all in it together. And I guess that's death too. None of us can avoid it. Not even Elon Musk or all these mad billionaires who are trying to prolong their lives forever. That mad guy who thinks he's going to live to 1,000 or whatever, and
who just looks quite ill now.
Yeah. And I think he has blood transfusions from his own son, which just feels to me so incredibly weird, to be like, son, you've been born and now I need all your blood. Like,
yeah.
So those kind of men who just think, nothing can ever touch them. I thought, where would be the worst place? And to me, it was being in hospital for 5 days.
And it's for all the details of a hospital, or your illness or whatever, the baseline is it's a total lack of control over your environment. And not through lack of people who want to help you, but it is basically a complete surrender. And this is what he has to do. But it's retrospective as well, because he's realizing that his life, as he understood it, wasn't what he thought either. He thought, I'm rich, everything's great. And he realizes that his family were ghastly, and all of the sort of the deeper layer than the sort of societal was a little bit more tissue thin than he'd realized. But I'd also love to talk about the sort of difference between Olivia, his wife, and Anthony, because there's a bit of kind of rub between the power that money has and the power that class has in a way that I haven't really seen in a kind of rich people book for years. Like it's really good on the nuance between the two and how kind of codependent they are as a society as well as individuals.
Yeah, I've always been, I've always been fascinated by the British class system in general. And I think, do you know who I think does it quite well is Julie Cooper writes about
Yeah.
class and money in quite an interesting way and how the two need each other. And I think, if you look at, if you look at the old money in this country, most of those people haven't had jobs in 1,000 years. They have a castle, but they might not actually have their own money.
Yeah.
So they kind of do need the new money. They need the kind of
Yeah.
investors and the people that want to be close to the titles and the houses. They need those people who'll come shooting on their estate because they need that kind of cash. But there is such a disdain for it. There's such a disdain for kind of the new money, and the kind of how brash, they do things all wrong. The Nicky Haslam tea towel thing, where he does a tea towel every year that says, what's common and what's not, and it's always something that you've done and you think, oh God.
And also, really, those lists always just seem completely arbitrary. They're things like putting snow boots on your child in the winter, and it's like, hang on, that seemed like a really sensible idea.
There was one that said going on holiday in half term, and I thought, well, when are parents supposed to go on holiday then? I don't understand. But I guess if you're posh like that, maybe you just understand those things. I don't know, but yeah. So I thought it was interesting to have a couple marry who one of them is kind of sort of old-fashioned posh, and one of them has made their own money. They're both bringing something to the table. Both of them think that they should therefore have the control, and that they're better than the other one. And so she's quite resentful, I think, because she kind of brings the clout, but he has brought everything else. And she actually, without money financially, she is just someone's wife. And I think she kind of deep down, she knows that, and she's slightly hemmed in by that. And not to go all sort of white feminist about Olivia, like, God, poor Olivia, she doesn't have any authority. But she sort of came to me because I thought a lot about Lord Lucan's wife, Lady Lucan.
Oh, yes.
And the fact that, for those that don't know about Lord Lucan, he was an earl, a hereditary peer who killed his nanny in the late 60s, meaning to kill his wife and accidentally killing the nanny. And I thought a lot about the fact that actually the kind of mythos of Lord Lucan is that no one really talks about Sandra Rivet, who was the nanny. No one really talked about Lady Lucan. It was all the fascination about this glamorous man who maybe escaped the country and what happened, Lucky Lucan.
His high life, gambling, wearing sort of velvet shoes and stuff. And it's like,
actually,
also the murder.
And also, if you dig into his life, he was the worst gambler in the world. He was a horrible person. People really disliked him. There really weren't any redeeming things to this fantasy that was created about him. And I thought a lot about her and how tragic her life must have been afterwards, actually. She was estranged from her children. She committed suicide in the end. But what her life must have been like after this terrible man had disappeared with, taking her reputation and her stability and all of that. And the other woman I thought of oddly was a friend of mine's mother when I was a teenager, who apparently was in the airport with another friend of ours' mother, and they were looking at some duty-free shop, and she turned to her and said, "Oh, that's a lovely necklace," or whatever it was, and said, "I wish just once I'd be able to buy something without asking my husband's permission." And this woman was in her 50s. And I remember thinking, oh God, you're wealthy, you're successful, but actually all of this is predicated on someone else and what that must feel like. So Olivia, she's ghastly, but she's ghastly because I think she has no real agency except that she gets invited to parties, and that's not really anything to brag about, is it?
And and it's like she knows the rules. She talks a lot about like, oh, I would never have been caught doing that kind of thing. Whereas Anthony's sort of charging through life like, oh, there's a rule, I'm gonna run at it and headbutt it. And there's a kind of caricature of the English aristocracy as that sort of Isabella Blow, Daphne Guinness sort of limitless wealth, so I can be as eccentric as I want to. And actually quite a lot of it is more we live in one really cold, damp corner of our castle. And the people that don't know the rules do seem to be having more fun over there with their kind of undiscreet clothes on.
And sorry, go on.
No, you.
No, I was just thinking you're totally right. There is that kind of perception of the upper classes, like kind of the Saltburn people. I think like when that came out, I
Yes.
thought, oh, she's obviously done that quite well, because I guess Emerald Fennell knows those people. She's in that world,
Yeah.
and so she kind of hit that perfectly. That thing where they're sort of loose and excited. But I think you're right. I think there's another element to that class thing, which is like more that you know to live within the rules of kind of, I guess it would be like unknowable things if you're not posh. It'd be things like you're wearing the correct jacket in the countryside or whatever, and they know those things. They're slightly hemmed in by those things. But also, I think for Olivia, it's that sense that nothing's really that serious, that nothing really matters. If something's awful, it's a bore rather than being a catastrophe. That
Yes.
everything's an inconvenience rather than something serious to kind of emotionally deal with. That kind of, it's the way I often look at the Johnson family and how they seem to find everything hilarious. Everything's just funny rather than
Yes.
tragic. It's the whole of life is to be looked at as a game.
Because if the
And I find
consequence
that
is
fascinating.
shame and you've decided not to be embarrassed, there's really not a consequence.
No. And everything can
Yeah.
just be a good laugh. And imagine just deciding that you can be like that. I think that is, if you grow up like that, I don't think you can just be like that. I think that you have to have been taught that by someone.
Well, this is why the sleuth is so brilliant. And I've just noticed that someone in the Q&A has said, are there spoilers for the book? I'm currently only halfway through, and we're going to come to the Q&A later, and we're going to spend like the last 15 minutes of the hour on that. But I did want to let that person know that I can't speak for Bella. I'm pretty confident that she won't be doing any spoilers, but I definitely won't be asking leading questions that will get anyone spoiled. But the sleuth, we hear from her perspective, and she's sort of from the sort of lineage of from Serial and that original true crime podcast, which I think I saw something recently about how it's the 10-year anniversary of Serial this year, which made me feel very aged. But then right up to the kind of TikTok world where actual crimes like the couple in the van last year, the sort of the hashtag van life couple, genuinely things that the police had decided to overlook, cases being kept alive, and where that sort of clashes with varying degrees of appropriate and intrusiveness. Because on the whole, it seems like Olivia, certainly the mother, and the 4 children, and there's Jemima, the older siblings' husband as well. They all seem quite keen for it not to have been a crime, because the societal shame that's sort of bubbling up and they're having to deal with, not like the Johnsons, they do seem still to be burdened with a sense of shame. But they're all quite kind of like, yeah, no, the autopsy said there wasn't a murder. But this woman, the sleuth, she's YouTubing live, and she's not wise to the ways of society's mores, and she would get everything on the tea towel wrong. But she's smart. She's the one that's noticing things. They all drop the ball around her because she used to work in the village pub, and she's just an invisible person.
Yeah, and I think, it's that invisibility and that sort of dismissing her, counting her out because she's a nobody, which means that actually they're incredibly complacent about kind of what they let her do and how they deal with her, because they just think she's a nothing, and actually she has the power to ruin their lives. But what you were saying about the kind of the documentary to podcast to TikTok pipeline is sort of something that I am completely obsessed with, because I noticed it, I think it's kind of a post-pandemic thing. And I think it has gone, I think humans have always been obsessed with crime. You look at,
Sure.
300 years ago, people going to public executions, the penny dreadful magazines in Victorian London, it would be ridiculous to say that this is a new thing, And I think part of it, which I think is the uncomfortable part, is that we are interested and titillated by violence. And I think oftentimes we deny that and we say, no, it's about, learning to be safe, or it's about finding justice. And I think, yes, it's all those things.
I'm not.
But it's also that we are kind of animalistic and we're interested in the kind of the worst murders. Jack the Ripper is famous not because he hit someone over the head with a kosh, it's because he ripped people up, sorry, that's a tangent, but basically, so I think the podcast thing was really interesting, that it's moved from, newspapers, the 90s newspapers, which always had, a serial crime on the front page, documentaries, podcasts. And then I think
at the
during
time,
COVID,
we believed that newspapers were a more respectable way of reporting it, because we didn't understand that it was only like decades later that we understood the sort of police and journalist way of working.
yeah,
I grew up
exactly.
thinking, well, it's in the papers, in this sort of similar way to I would now go, well, it's only on TikTok, but the lines are a bit more blurry.
And you think, the same power to ruin someone's life. Because I was thinking about Chris Jeffries, who was wrongly named for murdering a woman that lived in his flat in Bath, I think. Bath or Bristol.
Yes.
Yeah. And how the papers just ruined his life.
Of Christina Rossetti.
And he had kind of long hair, and they thought he looked weird. And it turned out that the papers had been hacking his phones and all that kind of stuff, and they ruined his life. But the TikTok thing I find fascinating, because I do think the internet has kind of democratized crime for everyone, right? So, and I think it was the pandemic, it was us all being inside, so actually the idea that you could see a crime happening somewhere, it's at 2 hours old, 3 hours old, and you're able to go on Google Maps, or you're able to, you can go on Twitter, you can see someone's social media profile, the victim, or the murderer. And I've seen that so much recently. For me, it was really sparked by Nicola Bulley tragically drowning in the river. And, armchair detectives turning up at the scene, they were investigating outhouses, they were looking for things, they were naming people, they were saying it was her husband. And then more recently with Jay Slater, who died in Tenerife, the teenager, TikTok lost its mind over Jay Slater. They were saying his family had done it in order to create a GoFundMe. And even after he was found, they don't believe what's happened. And I think that really feeds into the kind of distrust in mainstream media, and the kind of misinformation that the online world is spreading constantly. I think it's hard to deny that there's a link between that and the kind of anti-vax, conspiracy pipeline that so many people fall down.
Do you feel like it's the introduction of the algorithm? Because the sleuth in your novel, she says like, oh, I chucked out another video, I didn't really have anything to add, but I knew that I had to add enough, bit more content, and I had to make it this long because that's what works for the algorithm. And that's what happens if you look on TikTok when you're following a crime. Like, it's all it will show you, so it's all you believe. You don't see that there's the whole other world where everyone else is believing the other thing, unless you which frankly I've never bothered to do, to kind of go in like the other side of the story regarding whatever, and you believe your side is the side, or your opinion or your facts are the facts. And it shows like in this novel very clearly how previously the well-to-do could have gone, yep, no, nothing to see here, let's all move on. And it is technology that sort of kind of elbows in and says, no. It's she gets the numbers, basically.
Yeah, and it completely throws that kind of idea of, if you've been, say you were, Lord Lucan now, there would be people in every bar, in South America taking photos of people they thought was Lord Lucan. He would not have been able to hide.
Yeah,
whereas
he got nowhere.
Yeah, that was an upper class crime, and it was nothing to do with anyone else. And now, crime is everyone's business, basically. It's everyone's entertainment, and it's all about the likes. The algorithm is gonna reward you for putting out more content, more insane, wacky ideas. So she's kind of playing along with that, and she knows that a lot of the stuff that she's putting out might not be true, but it doesn't matter. And I guess that's true of everything online now, is that it sort of doesn't matter whether it's true, because that's not the point. If you're getting clicks, who cares?
Yeah.
TikTok will pay you for a video if it gets over 1 million hits, and it's not differentiating on whether you've spouted something accurately.
Yeah, there isn't a TikTok fact checking desk.
No, it's the Wild West. It's terrifying.
She believes that she wants to reach the truth. She believes that she's doing the right thing to get to the truth. And it's sort of, in lots of ways, a book about legacy, like what Anthony perceives is his legacy to the world, like the kind of person, the mark he left on the world he lived in. The kids and Olivia, the legacy is show me the money. And she is wanting the legacy of having, been the truth seeker with her big fiery sword. But also, it's really funny. I feel like we've gone deep with like the morals of TikTok or whatever. But I think it's important to talk about how this is a really funny book, and is that fun to write?
Yes, and I think I think for me, I've always loved, crime fiction. When I was growing up, I read every single Agatha Christie book. I read all of Dorothy L. Sayers. This is when I'm kind of 9 years old. I'm reading all of these books. Those are my sort of, and then point horror, point crime. Just voraciously reading as much crime. And then in my 20s, I was moving on to kind of Ian Rankin and Val McDermid, and then all of these kind of masters of the genre. But I always wanted to write like that, and I knew I couldn't. My brain doesn't work like that. I can't forensically plot detail like that. You see it in something like a Val McDermid, where you just know that she's talked to 50 forensic scientists in the last 20 years, and she understands blood spatter, and she understands, all of that stuff. And my brain just isn't like that. So I thought, if I'm going to write a kind of crime book, it's going to have something else to it. And for me, my whole life is sort of trying to, I'm constantly just trying to be as funny as my sister or my husband or whoever. And so it is really fun to write. And it's also a bit of a cop-out, because it just means I don't have to kind of worry about blood spatter, because I'm like, this is funny. It's not, I'm asking you as a reader, I guess, to kind of step out of full reality, and I'm moving you into a world which is kind of, it's 90% similar to ours, but there's a slight difference. And yeah, I think without the funny, it would be a very different book, and it would be lacking in something if I hadn't kind of really whacked out the kind of procedural parts of it, which, again, just not for me. I can't do it.
But there's something about these sort of new generation of kind of comedic crime, like the Richard Osman books, and one I interviewed at Christmas, the Janice Hallett, who she did The Appeal, and then she did the Christmas Appeal. And what they really are, I mean, there's a crime in them that you want to solve the riddle, but their social commentary, they are picking up where Jilly Cooper left off in that respect, where it's a fun way to poke fun at the people that you usually feel are in charge.
Yeah, and I think I'm obsessed with character. Like, that's what I like writing, is character. Like, I just get into their heads, and I have such a fun time doing it, and they stay with me for like months or years. And my sister, who's always my first reader, who's always saying, yes, but plot, Isabella, you have to put plot in here. And I'm thinking, okay, fine, but I love the character. So someone like Janice Hallett, who seems to be able to do both, plot and character, like, good for her. But for me, I'm always like, plot, great, but I want to get inside these people's heads, which I guess is why I pick people who the super, super rich. I actually don't know anyone like that, and I think, so for me, it's quite interesting going into the heads of people who are not me, not like me. I could write about the middle class experience really well, the kind of liberal, lefty, hypocritical, whatever it is, I could do that. And actually, I'm going to do that for the next one. But for me, it's so fun to kind of escape into these people's heads. And also, if it wasn't funny, if they were just that unlikable, I think the reader you probably wouldn't be able to bring the reader along for as long as I want them to be pulled along for, because I think you have to root for someone or like someone, and actually they're all so grim that I have to make you laugh. That's kind of my side of the bargain, is at least you can laugh with them or at them, so yeah, it is important.
Because you've done 2 novels with sort of super rich, super ghastly people receiving their comeuppance, and I feel like we have all, as a nation, put in a long shift of super rich, super ghastly people seeming to never get their comeuppance. And do you think that that life is cyclical and we'll find somebody, or do you feel like, looking at a shift in government, that you kind of find that sort of upper tier, there's been a bit, it's harder to be quite so vicious about someone like, Deputy Prime Minister or whatever. You want to kind of just carry on being really savage about who's in charge, but if who's in charge isn't quite so aggressively grim,
I think
you just
right.
think you'll find a different way of doing a different version of grim.
So I think I'll find a different way of doing a different version of grim, and I think that will probably, the next book will probably be, kind of the liberal elite, the people that sort of the papers love to hate, and I think that'll be quite fun, because that's sort of an area I know a lot about, and so it'll be different for me.
And there's not sanctimony there.
oh my God, like, so rich to write about. And I'm actually surprised that wasn't my first book, but But I think you're right. I think the government that we had for such a long time, and the cronyism and the super rich people that were kind of hanging around with these people, was so in our faces that, you know, we saw it every single day, and it felt like it was a government that was kind of encouraging those people, you know, come to Britain, you know, live in Mayfair, you know, give us money. And I think that was obviously quite, it must have been a thing in my brain of, you know, this is the world we currently live in. But on the other hand, there is a secondary thing to that, which is that the super wealthy, you know, when I was reading, or you were reading Hello magazine in the 90s, you know, there'd be the occasional minor royal, you know, right? And then there's a couple of people in a castle, but they weren't featuring the super rich in the way that we understand the super rich to be now. You know, the 0.0111%, these billionaires, these people who own 30 houses around the world, who pay tax nowhere. You know, they have a shell company on an island. They fly in by private jet and helicopter, and they don't use any of the same facilities as you. You know, the most they're going to use is a road with a driver, you know, in a Rolls Royce. And we can't see any of that except in things like when you walk around, if you're ever in central London, you walk around Mayfair at night, then there are no lights on any of the houses, because those houses have been bought by the super rich and no one lives in them. So I think there's quite a lot of that I see. And then things like, you know, hedge funds and private equity buying up almost every business, restaurant, anything that you ever frequent, you find out that, you know, behind that is a private equity firm. And that for me is the kind of galling bit, is the kind of the wealth disparity only seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And these people, you cannot get to them in any way. You know, these people they are so invisible. They're not on the rich list. They don't want to be anything as gauche as, you know, on the rich list. They want to be invisible, and they want their private island off New Zealand that they can go to when the world floods and they get to, you know, disappear. And we don't know who they are. And I just find that so interesting. Do you remember Ed Caesar wrote that amazing piece about trying to figure out, there's a house in Highgate, apparently it's one of the biggest private houses in London.
The Millionaires Row,
And he wrote this whole piece about his kind of 2-year search to try and find out who owned it, because it was in such a web of like legalese, and it ended up, you know, it was owned by an offshore firm in, again, like off the Seychelles somewhere, and he finally did figure out who owned it, but it took him 2 years. Because these people can do whatever they want. And actually I downplayed that in the book because I don't know those people. So it turns out they should have had, you know, 15 helicopters and all of this kind of stuff, and I completely downplayed it, and now I'm sort of pissed off with myself for not going harder on them.
Well, they have a fair bit. I don't think you should start beating yourself up about it. Now, I would love to, we've got sort of 10 minutes before we're going to do some questions, and I can see the questions coming in, which is brilliant. So if you do have one and you've been stealing yourself, get going, because we've got about 10 minutes. But I'd love to talk to you about your first book, Jog On, and a little bit about running, and then ask you a little bit about what's coming next, because we both wrote running books back in the day, and I think I'm right in saying that you are very much still running regularly.
I am. Are you not running anymore? Are you swimming now?
I swim a lot, and I do weights a lot, but I've been really injured. I had something wrong with my pelvis when I was pregnant, and I've never quite kind of got it back, and I miss it. But also, and I would like a professional opinion about this. You don't do loads of events, do you? You don't set yourself huge. You're like a quotidian runner. You've got your routes, and you just keep yourself to yourself.
Yeah, I've never ever run a public thing ever. And actually I remember reading your book, because your book, I was like reading your book, writing mine, being like, right, okay, good, great. I was like, apologies for that. But I was definitely, I did credit you. So it's not like I just boosted passages from it. But I remember, you know, you were going hard, you were running a marathon, and me thinking like, I'm never going to do that. Like that, it's just not, I could never do it. And sometimes people say, oh, I read Jog On and then I ran a marathon. I think, oh, you fucking bitch. You know, you went and did further than I did. But yeah, I think it would take the love of it out for me. And I think
that often is partly what happened with me.
Yeah. So I remember reading yours and reading about, you know, the glorious finish and all of that stuff. But then there's that bit afterwards where you're sort of like, okay, like I've overtrained to the point where I'm exhausted. I've done this impossibly hard thing. Why would I take 3 days off and then go back out there? Why would I? You know, and I think that's so true of so many runners. And the person that got me into running is my sister, and she's done that several times. And then she hasn't run for like 2 years. And I think, oh God, you know, I never want to lose that kind of that easiness that comes with just, you know, running down your high street or whatever. So
that's what I miss. I don't miss marathons at all. I really miss the feeling like doing some exercise and doing some exercise 10 minutes later.
Exactly. And it's immediate, whereas, I mean, I now weightlift as well because I'm post 40 and I think, oh my God, my bones, Christ, I'm like, I hit 40 and you're like, oh God, my bones. So I've been doing that as well, and a bit of Pilates, and I like both of them, but neither of them for me give me that immediate rush that running sometimes can. It's very elusive, obviously, but that moment when I was running through a park the other day and I suddenly realized I was having it, I was tingling, I was like, oh God, it's so good when it happens. And I've never found anything that comes as close to that as kind of keeping my head on straight. And so yeah, I think I mean, it's so shit to have an injury like that you've just not been able to quite right again. I mean,
I sort of know I could run, but it would make everything worse again.
I know, and if you've worked so hard to get to a point where that's not impacting you, to then suddenly
maybe I could just get like some Heelys or something. Just like whizzle on.
I'm sad that you can't run, because your book really, like, it made me understand that love of running.
I think I could. I think that the commitment it would take of like physio and maintenance with
and actually
bigger than the time I'd spend doing the running.
Exactly. And if you found other things that you love, I mean, it doesn't, I think the whole point about running is that, great if you like it, but don't struggle on with it for years if it's painful or you can't do it or you don't like it, and actually that's what I really treasure, the fact that my book, your book, there are a few that there are not many women's running books, but every other book in the running section is by a man who's doing kind of an ultra marathon, wearing no shoes and going backwards and racing, the best racer in the world. And you think, okay, it's just quite nice to read books about people who just want to run for the love of it, rather than kind of the sort of aggressive competitiveness of it.
The quantification of the self. But does this, and then this is going to be an amazing segue now. I admire you keeping going without, you're not training for a thing. You're able to do this sized amount of running and put it away and come back to it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Does that mean that you're one of those writers who goes, I've had an idea for a new novel and I shall write 1,000 to 1,500 words a day until I have finished my novel? Or are you just a huge fits and spurts person, Google hole for 2 days, don't speak to anyone for 2 days? Or do you have the sort of comparable discipline with that you do with running?
Once, I think it was Philip Pullman said he writes 500 words a day, and I thought, on earth do you ever get any of your books finished? Because 500 words a day does not feel like enough to be like powering through novels, like like the novels that he's written.
But it's 15,000 words a month.
Yeah, so when you put it like that, and if he has no days off, then that's amazing. So for me, I think I'm rigorous when I know there's a deadline looming. But if they, publishing is the worst like that, because they're like, okay, you've got a year to write it, and you think, great, I'll start next week, and then obviously you've got 3 months left, and you think, and so then you get on it. And so I've sort of, I'm what I will do is I'll write 1,000 words every day with the Pomodoro method, using the timer. And that's fantastic. And then I normally find anything over that does start getting slightly sloppy. And then if I'm in deadline mode, I'll write way more than that, and then edit the next morning, looking back and thinking, oh God, that was rubbish. That hasn't worked at all. But I don't treat it like a 9 to 5. I'm not sort of sitting down at the desk at 9 and clocking off at 5. I'm much more like, I'll go and sit over there for a bit. I'm going to walk around and procrastinate. Then I'm going, so there is a luxury of being able to do it at home and not having to worry about kind of, having to do set hours. So yeah, I mean, for the next one, my editor said like, cool, just have it in for like, I think she said July next year. And I'm just thinking, great, that's so long away. It's not, it's so not long away. But in my head, I'm like, great, I'll just take a month. Like, cool. I never learn.
I just need a research trip to Antibes.
Yeah, and can I expense that? Can I expense that to the publisher?
Sure.
I bet you they could do that in the 90s. I bet you people like Robert Harris could do that in the 90s.
God, yes. And how did you find, from a sort of nerdy, writerly perspective, the transition from non-fiction to fiction as a writer? Because for me, when I was doing non-fiction, I almost felt like, well, I know it happened. It's just on me to describe it as well as possible. I just need to be as sort of charismatic and persuasive as possible. And then I kind of got a sort of vertigo when it came to fiction of like, everybody can have yellow hair and purple feet, and there are no rules, and do I do my help?
That is
And I found
exactly
that
how I
so
felt.
hard. And you're
Me
living with
too.
invented people all day. You can't go off and interview someone to quote them as in the same way. But
Especially when you've done something nonfiction where you know that the truth has to be kind of, you have to be so careful, you know, especially if you're writing about things like mental health, that you don't spread misinformation or get the wrong thing, you know, write it blithely in your book and expect, you know, no one to challenge you. So that feels really daunting, but I understood how to do that. And then you're right, you sit down to write fiction, you're like, sorry, this is all coming out of my head. Like, what, I can just make everything up. And you kind of feel like you're lying. I felt like I was lying at
yeah,
the beginning. I was like, this feels like I'm just making things up. Because if you, nonfiction to fiction is, you do feel like vertigo. And then I think it was about 3 months into it, I suddenly felt like this is the most freeing thing I've ever done, because it's that flip side of like, oh, I'm making it up. And then being like, oh my God, I can make it up. This is
that's the only
amazing.
rule.
So, you know, when I'm writing Anthony in death, I'm thinking, this is fantastic. No one can tell me that I can't do this, because, you know, it's made up. It's brilliant. And sometimes people will message me about How to Kill Your Family and say, you know, I think that death wasn't very realistic. And I'm like, yeah, it's not. I made it up. Like, it's
Yeah,
just,
not
it's
meant
not
to be.
real.
Those are
It's
my
great.
rules.
So yeah, I can't imagine going back to writing something non-fiction now, especially I think because obviously for the books market, for someone like me, it would be write another personal book, you know, which they
Yeah,
tried to get me to do after Jog On. They said, you know, why don't you write about, you know, trampolining your way out of sadness or whatever, you know, they were kind of coming up with other ideas. And I was thinking it will be disingenuous and like a weaker
yeah.
thing to do. So I deliberately thought this is my moment where I can try and pivot to fiction. But yeah, I think I've sort of drained that well of, you know, unless my husband sort of leaves me for, I don't know, you know, Taylor Swift, it's probably not another memoir in there. So yeah, fiction for me is now I'm happy. I'm like, oh, this is great. I don't have to put any footnotes in the back. It's great.
Yeah. Well, quick, we've got a couple of minutes before I dive into the questions. But putting aside the My Husband Left Me for Taylor Swift memoir, what's coming up next? Because there's TV adaptation. Is that genuinely, is that happening where like sometimes that
Um,
sits on the bottom of a press release for 5 years and then everyone politely stops asking and
Well, maybe that is very possible. Exactly. I think people in TV, like I didn't understand until like they came to see me as well. I kind of thought if something gets announced, they've already made it and it's already filmed, and you know you'll see it on your screens in 6 weeks. And I keep having to say to people like, oh, it's not filming until 2026 supposedly. And Anya
okay.
Taylor-Joy, who they've got attached to it, could easily drop out. You know, she might get a much better offer. In which case, you know, they're going to find another actress, or you know, the director will drop out. And you're right, it might just end up quietly shelved, and people say, weren't you gonna? And I say, no, that was a long time ago. So I'm not having anything to do with that really. I mean, I've been allowed to meet.
Okay.
I've been allowed to meet the writers, but I think when it comes to the book author, they really want you to stay as far away as possible. I think they think, thank you so much. Now, please, you know,
Yeah.
shuffle off and let us kind of rework everything for TV, which is completely fair. So I'm letting them do that. And I just want to watch it like a viewer, you know, where you watch 8 episodes in one day, you can't remember anything about it 3 weeks later. That's how I want to watch it. And so yeah, I'm just writing another book basically. Like it's that conveyor belt thing of you finish it and you're like, I finished, this is amazing. And then you're like, what am I doing? And then you're like, oh, I'm just writing another book. That's what I'm doing. I'm writing another book. So
And you
that's what I'm
have
doing.
your idea and you're off and running.
I do. I'm off and running. It's going to be set in North London about a kind of, as I said, a sort of liberal elite family, and I think that is rich pickings. So hopefully, I won't just be writing. I won't just be punching up. I'll be also punching sideways, punching myself.
Oh, thank you for telling us about it and chatting so brilliantly about everything. Now I'm gonna resign from being questioner. I'm gonna be questioner, reader, outerer. Okay, is there a reason the sleuth is unnamed for most of the book? And I used female pronouns because I did part of the book as an audiobook. And I did that thing of not knowing. And then when I heard the audiobook, I was like, oh, okay, they've made the decision for me.
Yeah, that was funny actually, because I wrote The Sleuth as a man, and my editor was like read it and said, oh, I love The Sleuth, she's fantastic. And I said, no, The Sleuth is a boy, The Sleuth is not a woman.
Oh,
And
wow.
she was adamant. She said, no, The Sleuth is a woman. I thought, Okay, actually, that's probably more interesting, because in my head it was a kind of maybe the slight cliche of a lonely man who, is sitting kind of, in his parents' house, being a bit sad. And actually, that is a stereotype, and it's not a great one, because actually the people that are interested in true crime are all sorts of people. And so my sleuth, she's unnamed because I think partly I don't want you really to understand or know anything about her, because she's so obsessed with this other family. She's kind of, you're in her world a little bit, but you don't really get to know her properly. And then partly because at the end there is a kind of, you might get a better understanding of what's motivated her at the end. But I like the idea that she's kind of, to the reader, she's a faceless internet account, in the same way that that's what you'd get if you were, if you were watching these people. Sometimes they don't show their faces at all. They're just narrating to photos or images, and actually you don't know who's telling you this information. So that's kind of why she's anonymous. But it's interesting that, that you sort of were listening and then suddenly, oh, it's a woman, right?
Yeah. Somebody else has asked, thank you for a fantastic Q&A, first of all. And they recently listened to your podcast with Annie Mac, and they want to know, who would you say is most influential in your writing, and whose validation do you mostly seek when you've completed a book? Which I love that question. I'm totally stealing it for all future interviews.
I'm also stealing that. I've got to interview another author tomorrow, and I'm going to steal that. So thank you. What was the first part of the question? Because the second part was so good.
The first part was who was most influential.
Oh, okay. That's difficult, because I think if you say, say I said, Charles Dickens, then I sound like I think that I'm as lofty and brilliant as Charles Dickens. Do you know what I mean? I say like, oh, well, actually, of course, it's all based on, some random philosopher. So I can't say anyone fantastic, because that just makes me sound appalling. I think probably for me, it's like, it's comedies like, I don't know, Veep and Succession, things like that, the humor of those mixed with, for me, it's Agatha Christie, who I think writes the perfect crime novels, and they're always about kind of normally terrible upper class people, doing terrible things and having terrible things done to them. And I love her so much. I go to bed every night listening to one of her audiobooks every single night of my life since I was a teenager. My husband just goes to sleep like a normal person, like, as I would say, like raw dogging the world, just nothing in his ears, and I'm like lying there listening to Murder on the Orient Express for the 78th time, being like, this is so comforting, they're just about to get to the murder. So yeah, I always have her at the back of my brain. And sorry, the second part, who do I want validation from? I want validation from everyone. I think writers are like some of the most insecure, like whiny babies in the world. And Joe Lycett once said a really funny thing to Greg, my husband, about how the dream for every famous person is that their agent one day texts them and says, and by the way, everyone else has died and you've won. Because they want all the gigs, they want every show. And so as a writer, you kind of, the idea that I would ever go onto my own Goodreads or something would just kill me dead in a minute. But really what I want is, I want my mum and my sister to laugh. So they're my first readers. And if they laugh, then for me, that's magic, because like, they're not hard to make laugh, but they would tell me. They're the kind of people that would say like, this isn't good. So they're the people I always want to impress, I guess.
Brilliant. If you lived a day, as this is from Laura Colburn P, I think that is, rather than Colburn Nep. If you lived a day as one of the super rich, what would you do?
Oh, I used to have this fantasy when I was little that all I wanted to do was be invisible, and I just wanted to go to like the most expensive department store and just take everything. And I don't know how I thought that would work, but I just thought I could just walk in and take all the diamonds, all the dresses, do all of that. If I was a super rich person, what would I do in a day now? I think they live quite boring lives. That's the thing. I think, okay, fine, you can jet around the world and you can go for lunch in Saint-Tropez and then fly back in your helicopter. Actually, now I'm saying that does sound quite nice, doesn't it? But I think in general, I'm thinking, if I was the super rich, I would have like 8 modern closed down for me for the day. And I would go and look at every single art piece. And I would do that for museums. I would just make them close them down for me so that I could walk around them and have my own access. Because I think that's the good thing about having money, is that it allows you access to things that like everyone else doesn't get. So that's what I would do. I would spend money and like make the Vatican open for me on a weekend, as long as I didn't actually have to meet the Pope or anything. So yeah, that's what I would do.
So someone once told me about 20 years ago, there was a massive Hollywood star, like a kind of someone who's still famous, but like was young and beautiful in the 70s, who had on retainer one of our London's sort of best known, I think they presented, even they did stuff on Front Row or something, but like a cultural critic. And whenever he came to London, this person was just sort of on retainer to like go around some galleries with him, telling him, explaining the paintings and saying, oh, well, actually the Guardian thought this, but the Financial Times, they were much kinder. And I always thought that seemed, I couldn't tell which part of the equation was more intoxicating to me, to have that, to have the luxury of being able to summon your chosen critic to just sort of chat to, or being a kind of scruffy London critic that somebody you'd be like, I've had the call. I've got
And also
to get to the National Portrait Gallery by 7.
It's definitely the critic. The critic has the best time there, because all that critic wants is for people to listen to him spout off about how, you know, interesting he finds himself, and he's doing it for a Hollywood person, and he's getting paid. Like, you assume that was the best day of that critic's life. And to be a celebrity, it'll be like, you know, something he can brag about for 5 minutes. That critic, it's like on his tombstone. Yeah, to be able to pay for people to do things like that would be phenomenally fun. But I think most of those kind of super rich people, they're just sort of bored on their phones, flying around in private jets like the Kardashians or whatever. They don't seem to do anything interesting. You know, they just have balloon parties or whatever. It
I
seems
must
quite
say,
dull to me.
I've sort of drifted off the Kardashians, because I've Khloe Kardashian in particular, I found to be, it was no longer aspirational. It looked miserable.
Miserable, yeah. And she, like 10 years ago, I thought she was quite funny and sort of human.
Yeah.
And then just sort of became like the rest of them. And I just find them all, yeah, just quite dull. I just think they all look so bored.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we've had 2 different questions about, which are effectively about the same thing. Someone's asked about what software you use and if you just write in Word. And someone else has quite rightly picked me up on what the Pomodoro method is that you mentioned, and we just galloped past because I could see we were running out of time, and I'm interested in that. And but now we can stop and pause. So do you work in any particular software, and can you give us a run through of the Pomodoro technique?
Yes, so I use Google Docs.
Do you? I wrote
I
one
know.
book in Google Docs and it nearly sent me up the wall.
So I love Google Docs because it auto saves everything. Whereas when I've worked in Word doing edits, it doesn't auto save. And I once lost 3 days worth of edits because I hadn't realized that it wasn't auto saving. I do need to get Word, because I saw someone on Threads the other day being like, please, for the love of God, authors, stop using Google Docs. It's so insecure. You know, Word is so secure for authors. And
Oh,
I
I
hadn't
hadn't
realized
thought of
that. Yeah. So I've written, 130,000 words in Google Docs, and without ever thinking like maybe that's not secure. So
oh my
next
God,
book,
that's actually made me feel quite nauseous, the thought of
I
someone
know.
able to access halfway through an edit
Imagine like Russian hackers got halfway through your writing and then asked for a ransom for you to give it back. I mean, so it's going to be Word from now on. And the Pomodoro method is really simple. It's just, I mean, I'm making it more simple than it probably is, but it's basically, you can get an app and all this kind of stuff, but it's basically you just set a timer on your phone for 25 minutes and then you put your phone somewhere else. And for some reason, knowing that there's a timer makes you concentrate incredibly well on any task that you're doing, be it writing or anything else. And the timer goes off and you get like a 2 or 3 minute break, put the timer back on, and then you get like a 4-minute break after that. So you do it in shifts. So it's called the Pomodoro method because I think they used one of those old-fashioned tomato timers. But you can use whatever you want. And it's such a helpful thing. If you're struggling, your mind's wandering, you're procrastinating, if you do the Pomodoro method, you'll be amazed at how quickly your mind focuses. It's really good.
I must confess, just setting the timer isn't enough for me. I use software called Freedom, which originally it just locked you off the internet. But
Right.
now you can set it so, you can choose 3 people if they email you or something like that, or, breaking
Right.
if there's a, disaster. But you can set it to how long it locks the internet for you. And I can't do anything without usually what happens is in the second 20 minutes, I've forgotten about it and I carry on writing. But the first 20 minutes, I'm like, this is horrendous. Oh God, oh God. So
Yeah,
freedom.
I think about that, but then I see my husband has one of those lock things, and he's just all I can see him doing. He doesn't use the internet less; he's just typing in the code more. And I'm like, well, this kind of defeats the point because it's more work for you, but you're still doing it.
I've never managed to crack freedom.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So maybe yours is a more hardcore version.
Okay. Now then, I'm just scanning through. Oh, people thanking you because they've become runners.
See, I love that, but again, makes me intimidated because they're always better runners than me, and then I'm always like,
well, no,
oh,
she's
God.
very specific. It's somebody called Claire. She's not a marathon runner. She said it's not a question, but Jog On inspired me to try running after deciding I wasn't a runner, and I found I love it. I'm not a marathon runner. 5K is my max, but I've never done a park run. So thank you, Bella. Gear shift. Amina wants to know, if you have a dramatic death like Anthony, spiked, literally, what would that look like for you?
Oh God, what if I was to have a dramatic death myself?
Like the opposite of having your
I'll tell you what it would be. It would be for me, I don't know why, it would be falling out of a hot air balloon.
Yes.
Because
Or
my
the
friend's
hot air
ex-husband,
balloon just sort of
it's all, yeah, or it kind of collapsing. But my friend's ex-husband's mother owned a hot air balloon company in the north of England, and they were constantly offering us to go on free hot air balloons. And I always thought, I'm sorry, but like fire in a tent with like sandbags. So like, I just thought, no one thought this through. This is a Victorian contraption that we should be better than this now. So that always freaks me out.
Incomprehensible to me. Like, let's make a floating platform with some fire on it and put it this high. It just wouldn't happen. Why is the pretty colourful balloon making people fall for this?
It's because it's so beautiful. And also imagine you're up there in the sky, and it must be so beautiful just moments before your death. I just think I got really obsessed with reading about the Hindenburg the other day, because it turned out that there was an English version of the Hindenburg which did like a couple of journeys to, I think they did one journey across the Atlantic and one somewhere else in Europe, and then just a fiery ball pit. But I thought, sorry, who thought that this was a good idea? They were smoking on board. Like, just, you should go and Google it. I can't remember what the British version was called, but like the whole thing just reads like a Darwin Award. It's fascinating.
I told someone recently that I could just about remember as a child that people used to smoke on the tube, and that the tubes had wooden steps.
Wooden escalators. I mean, what on earth? I know. My mum said that. She was like, we'd smoke on planes. Planes!
It's just mind-blowing. Okay, there's two key questions left. They're both very brief. One is, you're talking about the new book, but when is it coming out?
So hopefully that will be out in 2026, early 2026.
Okay.
So it'll be quicker than this one, because this one was 3 years. The next one will be 2 years. Publishing takes forever. It's never the writer. It's just that the whole process, this takes so long.
Yeah, it does. And weird, unfathomable things are to do with scheduling, that are to do with paper stock at certain times of the year, that my eyes glaze over when they tell me them, but I still don't know what they're saying. Finally, somebody says they heard Barney bark, and can they see him?
Yes. I would never offer this, because like then I'm just being the person who's made their dog a personality. But you can see him.
I mean, that horse dog has bolted. Yay!
Luckily,
look at that!
I took him out for an incredibly long walk just before we did this, so that he would be exhausted. So one bark, I will say, is incredibly impressive from Barney, because normally he's like pushing me, hitting me, trying to get me to take him out. So that's the
look at him though. He's like dream dog. Well done in your event, Mum.
Honestly, I mean, imagine this dog is like came from Battersea, and now he's just like lying here demanding belly rubs. He's got the best life in the whole world. So yeah. I thought I was going to get away with not one message from about Barney, but it's never going to happen.
I was worried that would be an inappropriate question, so I asked it right on 8 o'clock.
No, it's very good.
You had the option to go, no, time's up. He's nowhere near.
Well, no, sadly, he's always near. Thank you so much, Alex. That was so fun.
Thank you everyone who joined us, and thank you Bella and Barney.